Chapter 7. The Dragon. The Danes at Exeter, being now cut off from all hope of relief, asked for terms, and the king granted them their lives on condition of their promising to leave Wessex and not to return. This promise they swore by their most solemn oaths to observe, and marched northward, passed out of Wessex, and settled near Gloucester. Some of the Saxons thought that the king had been wrong in granting such easy terms, but he pointed out to the ealdormen who remonstrated with him that there were many other and larger bands of Danes in Mercia and Anglia, and that had he massacred the band at Exeter, and this he could not have done without the loss of many men, as assuredly the Danes would have fought desperately for their lives, the news of their slaughter would have brought upon him fresh invasions from all sides. By this time all resistance to the Danes in Mercia had ceased. Again and again King Burhred had bought them off, but this only brought fresh hordes down upon him, and at last, finding the struggle hopeless, he had gone as a pilgrim to Rome, where he had died. The Danes acted in Mercia as they had done in Northumbria. They did not care themselves to settle down for any length of time, and therefore appointed a weak Saxon thane, Ceolwulf, as the king of Mercia. He ruled cruelly and extorted large revenues from the landowners, and robbed the monasteries, which had escaped destruction, of their treasures. The Danes suffered him to pursue this course until he had amassed great wealth, when they swooped down upon him, robbed him of all he possessed, and took away the nominal kingship he had held. As there was now but little fresh scope for plundering in England, many of the Danes, both in Anglia and Mercia, settled down in the cities and on the lands which they had taken from the Saxons. The Danes who had gone from Exeter were now joined by another band which had landed in South Wales. The latter, finding but small plunder was to be obtained among the mountains of that country, moved to Gloucester, and joining the band there, proposed a fresh invasion of Wessex. The Danes, in spite of the oaths they had sworn to Alfred and the hostages they had left in his hands, agreed to the proposal, and early in the spring of 878 the bands, swollen by reinforcements from Mercia, marched into Wiltshire and captured the royal castle of Chippenham on the Avon. From this point they spread over the country and destroyed everything with fire and sword. A general panic seized the inhabitants. The better class, with the bishops, priests, and monks, made for the seacoasts and sent across to France, taking with them all their portable goods, with the relics, precious stones, and ornaments of the churches and monasteries. Another party of Danes in 23 ships had landed in Devonshire. Here the ealdorman Ada had constructed a castle similar to that which Edmund had built. It was fortified by nature on 3 sides, and had a strong rampart of earth on another. The Danes tried to starve out the defenders of the fort, but the Saxons held out for a long time, although sorely pressed by want of water. At last they sallied out one morning at daybreak and fell upon the Danes and utterly defeated them, only a few stragglers regaining their ships. 1,000 Danes are said to have been slain at Kynwith, but this was an isolated success. In all other parts of the kingdom panic appeared to have taken possession of the West Saxons. Those who could not leave the country retired to the woods, and thence, when the Danes had passed by, leaving ruin and desolation behind them, they sallied out and again began to till the ground as best they could. Thus for a time the West Saxons, formerly so valiant and determined, sank to the condition of serfs, for when all resistance ceased, the Danes were well pleased to see the ground tilled, as otherwise they would speedily have run short of stores. At the commencement of the invasion, Edmund had marched out with his band and had inflicted heavy blows upon parties of plunderers, but he soon perceived that the struggle was hopeless. He therefore returned to Sherborne, and collecting such goods as he required, and a good store of provisions, he marched to the place where the ship had been hidden. No wandering band of Danes had passed that way, and the bushes with which she had been covered were undisturbed. These were soon removed, and a passage 3 feet deep and wide enough for the ship to pass through was dug from the deep hole in which she was lying to the river. When the last barrier was cut, the water poured in, and the Saxons had the satisfaction of seeing the vessel rise gradually until the water in the dock was level with that in the river. Then she was taken out into the stream, the stores and fittings placed aboard, and she was poled down to the mouth of the river. Egbert had gone before, and had already engaged 15 sturdy sailors to go with them. The Danes had not yet reached the seacoast from the interior, and there was therefore no difficulty in obtaining the various equipments necessary. In a week her masts were up and her sails in position. The Dragon, as she was called, excited great admiration at the port, all saying that she was the finest and largest ship that had ever been seen there. While her fitting out had been going on, she was hove to on shore, and received several coats of paint. Edmund was loath to start on his voyage without again seeing the king, but no one knew where Alfred now was, he, on finding the struggle hopeless, having retired to the fastnesses of Somerset to await the time when the Saxons should be driven by oppression again to take up arms. At last all was ready, and the Dragon put out to sea. She was provided with oars as well as sails, but these were only to be used when in pursuit or when flying from a superior enemy. As soon as she had been long enough at sea to enable the band again to recover from the effects of sickness, the oars were got out and the men practised in their use. As in the models from which she had been built, she rowed 2 banks of oars, the one worked by men upon deck, the other through small portholes. The latter could only be used when the weather was fine. When the sea was high they were closed up and fastened. The lower deck oars were each rowed by 1 man, while the upper bank, which were longer and heavier, had each 2 men to work it. Before starting, Edmund had increased the strength of his band to 90 men, that number being required for the oars, of which the Dragon had 15 on each bank on each side. At first there was terrible splashing and confusion, but in time the men learned to row in order, and in 3 weeks after putting to sea the oars worked well in time together, and the Dragon, with her 90 rowers, moved through the water at a great rate of speed. During this time she had never been far from land, keeping but a short distance from the port from which she had sailed, as Edmund did not wish to fall in with the Danes until his crew were able to maneuver her with the best effect. When at last, satisfied that all knew their duty, he returned to port, took in a fresh supply of provisions, and then sailed away again in search of the enemy. He coasted along the shore of Hampshire and Sussex without seeing a foe, and then sailed round Kent, entered the mouth of the Thames. The Dragon kept on her way until she reached the point where the river begins to narrow, and there the sails were furled and the anchor thrown overboard to wait for Danish galleys coming down the river. On the 3rd day after they had anchored they perceived 4 black specks in the distance, and these the sailors soon declared to be Danish craft. They were rowing rapidly, having 10 oars on either side, and at their mastheads floated the Danish Raven. The anchor was got up, and as the Danes approached, the Golden Dragon, the standard of Wessex, was run up the masthead. The sails were hoisted, the oars got out, and the vessel advanced to meet the approaching Danes. These for a moment stopped rowing in astonishment at seeing so large a ship bearing the Saxon flag. Then they at once began to scatter in different directions. But the Dragon, impelled both by the wind and her 60 oars, rapidly overtook them. When close alongside the galley nearest to them, the men on the upper deck, at an order from Edmund, ran in their oars, and seizing their bows, poured a volley of arrows into the galley, killing most of the rowers. Then the Dragon was steered alongside, and the Saxons, sword in hand, leaped down into the galley. Most of the Danes were cut down at once, the rest plunged into the water and swam for their lives. Leaving the deserted galley behind, the Dragon continued the pursuit of the others, and overtook and captured another as easily as she had done the first. The other 2 boats reached the shore before they were overtaken, and those on board, leaping out, fled. The Saxons took possession of the deserted galleys. They found them, as they expected, stored full of plunder of all kinds, rich wearing apparel, drinking goblets, massive vessels of gold and silver which had been torn from some desecrated altar, rich ornaments and jewels and other articles. These were at once removed to the Dragon. Fire was applied to the boats, and they were soon a mass of flames. Then the Dragon directed her course to the 2 galleys she had first captured. They were also rifled of their contents and burned. The Saxons were delighted at the success which had attended their first venture. "We shall have rougher work next time," Egbert said. "The Danes who escaped will carry news to London, and we shall be having a whole fleet down to attack us in a few days. If they are in anything like reasonable numbers, we will fight them. If not, we can run. We have seen today how much faster we are than the Danish boats, and though I shall be in favour of fighting if we have a fair chance of success, it would be folly to risk the success of our enterprise by contending against overwhelming numbers at the outset. seeing that we shall be able to pick up so many prizes round the coast." "We can beat a score of them," Egbert grumbled. "I am in favour of fighting the Danes whenever we see them." "When there is a hope of success, Egbert, yes. But you know even the finest bull can be pulled down by a pack of dogs. The Dragon is a splendid ship, and does credit alike to King Alfred's first advice, to the plans of the Italian shipbuilders, and to the workmanship and design of the shipwright at Essex, and I hope she will long remain to be a scourge to the Danes at sea, as they have been a scourge to the Saxons on shore. And it's because I hope she is going to do so good service to England that I would be careful of her. You must remember, too, that many of the Danish galleys are far larger than those we had to do with today. We're not going to gobble them all up as a pike swallows minnows." The Dragon had now anchored again, and 4 days elapsed before any Danish galleys were seen. At the end of that time 6 large Danish warships were perceived in the distance. Edmund and Egbert from the top of the lofty poop watched them coming. "They row 30 oars each side," Egbert said, "and are crowded with men. What say you, Edmund? Shall we stop and fight them, or shall the Dragon spread her wings?" "We have the advantage of height," Edmund said, "and from our bow and stern castles can shoot down into them, but if they lie alongside and board us, their numbers will give them an immense advantage. I should think that we might run down 1 or 2 of them. The Dragon is much more strongly built than these galleys of the Danes, and if when they close round us we have the oars lashed on both sides, as when we are rowing, it will be next to impossible for them to get alongside except at the stern and bow, which are far too high for them to climb." "Very well," Egbert said. "If you are ready to fight, you may be sure I am." The anchor was got up and the oars manned, and the Dragon quietly advanced toward the Danish boats. The men were instructed to row slowly, and it was not until within 100 yards of the leading galley that the order was given to row hard. The men strained at the tough oars, and the Dragon leaped ahead to meet the foe. Her bow was pointed as if she would pass close by the side of the Danish galley, which was crowded with men. When close to her, however, the helmsman pushed the tiller across, and the Dragon swept straight down upon her. A shout of dismay rose from the Danes. A hasty volley of arrows and darts was hurled at the Dragon, and the helmsman strove to avoid the collision, but in vain. The Dragon struck her on the beam. The frail craft broke up like an eggshell under the blow, and sank almost instantly under the bows of the Dragon. Without heeding the men struggling thickly in the water, the Dragon continued her course. Warned by the fate of the first boat, the next endeavoured to avoid her path. Her commanders shouted orders. The rowers on one side backed while those on the other pulled, but she was not quite quick enough. The Dragon struck her a few feet from the stern, cutting her in 2. The other galleys now closed in alongside. The Saxons hastily fastened their oars as they had been rowing, and then betook themselves to the posts, those with spears and swords to the sides to prevent the enemy from climbing up, the archers to the lofty castles at either end. The Danes had the greatest difficulty in getting alongside, the oars keeping the galleys at a distance. For some time the combat was conducted entirely by the archers on both sides, the Danes suffering much the most heavily, as the Saxons were protected by the bulwarks, while from their lofty positions they were enabled to fire down into the galleys. At last one of the Danish vessels rowed straight at the broadside of the Dragon, and breaking her way through the oars, her bow reached the side. Then the Danes strove to leap on board, but the Saxons pursued the tactics which had succeeded so well on land, and forming in a close mass where the Danish vessel touched the Dragon, opposed a thick hedge of spears to those who strove to board her. The Danes fought desperately. Several notable leaders, hearing that a great Saxon ship had appeared on the Thames, had come down to capture her, and leading their followers strove desperately to cut their way to the deck of the Dragon. Taking advantage of the strife, the other galleys repeated the maneuver which had succeeded, and each in turn ran their stem through the Saxon oars, and reached the side of the Dragon. In this position, however, they had the immense disadvantage that only a few men at once could strive to board, while the Saxons were able to oppose all their strength at these 4 points. For a time the Saxons repulsed every effort, but as the lashings of the oars gave way under the pressure of the Danish ships, these drifted alongside, and they were thus able to attack along the whole length of the bulwarks between the castles. The Saxons were now hard put to it, but their superior height still enabled them to keep the Danes in check. All this time the 5 vessels had been drifting down the river together. Presently, when the conflict was the hottest, the chief of the sailors made his way to Edmund. "If we get up the sails we may be able to draw out from the galleys." "Do so," Edmund said, "and at once, for we are hardly pressed, and there are 4 to 1 against us." The sailors at once sprang to the halyards, and soon the great sail rose on the mast. Almost instantly the Dragon began to glide away from the galleys. The Danes with ropes endeavoured to lash themselves to her sides, but these were severed as fast as thrown, and in 2 or 3 minutes the Dragon had drawn herself clear of them. The Danes betook themselves to their oars, but many of these had been broken between the vessels, and rowing their utmost they could only just keep up with the Dragon, for the wind was blowing freely. Fully half the oars of the Dragon were broken, but the rest were soon manned, and she then rapidly drew away from her pursuers. "I am not going to run further," Edmund said. "Now that we have once shaken them off, let us turn and meet them again." As the vessel's head was brought up into the wind the Danes ceased rowing. The fate which had befallen their 2 galleys at the commencement of the fight was still before them. They had lost great numbers of men in the attempt to board from the Saxon pikes and arrows, and their desire to renew the fight vanished when they saw that the Saxons were equally ready. Therefore, as the Dragon approached them, they sheered off on either side of her and rowed for the mouth of the Medway. The Saxons did not pursue. They had lost 8 men killed and 17 wounded by the Danish arrows, and were well content to be quit of their opponents, upon whom they had inflicted a severe blow, as each of the galleys sunk had contained fully 150 men, and great numbers of the Danes on board the other ships had fallen. They now left the Thames and sailed to Sandwich. The town had been shortly before burned by the Danes, but these had left, and some of the inhabitants had returned. Here the Dragon waited for a week, by the end of which time the traces of the conflict had been obliterated, and new oars made. Edmund found no difficulty in filling up the vacancies caused in the fight, as many of the young Saxons were burning to avenge the sufferings which the Danes had inflicted, and could have obtained several times the number he required had there been room for them. He was therefore enabled to pick out sturdy fellows accustomed to the sea. When the Dragon again set sail, her head was laid to the northward, as Edmund intended to cruise off East Anglia, from whose shores fleets were constantly crossing and recrossing to Denmark. They picked up several prizes at the mouths of the eastern rivers, scarcely having to strike a blow, so surprised were the Danes at the appearances of the great Saxon galleys. Whenever the Danes surrendered without resistance, Edmund gave them quarter, and landed them in small boats on the shore. Their ships, after being emptied of the booty they contained, were burned. When off Yarmouth, where they had captured 4 Danish vessels sailing out unsuspicious of danger, the wind veered round to the northeast, and began to blow very strongly. The long line of sandbanks off the coast broke somewhat the violence of the sea, and the Dragon rode all night to her anchors. But in the morning the wind continued to rise. The sea became more and more violent, and the anchors began to drag. Edmund and Egbert, after a consultation, agreed that their only chance of saving the vessel was to enter the river. The tide was running in, but the sea was so heavy on the bar of the river that the efforts of the crew at the oars barely sufficed to keep her on her course. At length, however, she made her way safely between the posts which marked the entrance, and, rowing up until they passed a turn, were sheltered from the force of the gale, and again anchored. As soon as the anchors were let go, the Danes began to fire their arrows, but so powerful was the gale that the greater part of them were swept far away. As the day went on, the number of Danes on the bank increased largely, and vast numbers of arrows were discharged at the Dragon. The crew kept under shelter, and although she was often struck, no damage was done. In the afternoon a fleet of galleys was seen coming down the river. The Danes possessed a large number of these boats at Yarmouth, and in these they navigated the inland waters far into the interior. The wind had shifted until it was blowing nearly due east, and Edmund and Egbert had agreed upon the best course to be pursued. In case of attack, they could hardly hope finally to beat off the assault of a large fleet of galleys, and would besides be exposed to attack by boats laden with combustibles. Therefore, as soon as the galleys were seen approaching, the oars were unlashed, the great sail hoisted, and at her best speed the Dragon advanced up the river to meet her foes. The Danes gave a shout of alarm as the vessel advanced to meet them, with the waters surging in a white wave from her bows, and the greater part of them hurried towards one bank or the other to escape the shock. Some, slower in movement or stouter in heart, awaited the attack, while from all a storm of missiles was pouring upon the advancing boat. Heedless of these, she continued her way. Her sharp bow crashed right through the side of the Danish boats, and having destroyed 7 of them on her way, she passed through the flotilla and continued her course. The Dragon waved triumphantly from her mast as she passed under the walls of Yarmouth. These were crowded with Danes, who vainly showered arrows and javelins as she flew past, with the fleets of galleys rowing in her wake. A few minutes and she was out on the broad sheet of water beyond. The Danish galleys paused at the entrance in so wild a storm they would have had difficulty in keeping their boats straight, while the great galley with her sails and oars would be able to maneuver freely, and could strike and run them down one by one. "What is that pile of buildings on the rising knoll of ground some 3 miles away?" Edmund asked. "That's Bamborough Castle," Egbert replied, "a Roman stronghold of immense strength." "Let us run up thither," Edmund said. "If, as is likely enough, it is unoccupied, we will land there and take possession. Are the walls complete?" "Assuredly they are," Egbert said. "They are of marvellous strength, such as we cannot build in our days. They run in a great semicircle from the edge of the water round the crest of the knoll and down again to the water. There is but one gateway in the wall on the land side, and this we can block up. We need not fear an attack from the land, for between the river and the castle there are wide swamps, so that unless they row up and attack us from the water, we are safe." "I think they will not do that," Edmund said, "after the taste which the Dragon has given them of her quality. At any rate, I think we are safe till the storm abates." By this time, running rapidly before the wind, the Dragon was approaching the great Roman fort, whose massive walls struck Edmund with astonishment. No one was to be seen moving about in the space enclosed by them. The sail was lowered and the vessel brought to the bank. The anchors were taken ashore, and she was soon solidly moored. Then the crew leapt on to the land and ascended the bank to the great level enclosure. The walls were, as Egbert had said, intact, and indeed, except on the side facing the river, remained almost unbroken to the present day. An hour's labour sufficed to block the gateway, where a pair of massive doors were in position, for the place had been defended by the Saxons against the Danes at their first landing on the coast. A few men were placed as sentries on the walls, and, feeling now perfectly safe from any attack on the land side, Edmund and his followers returned on board the Dragon for the night. Chapter 8: The Cruise of the Dragon. The night passed without alarm. The gale continued to blow with fury, and until it abated Edmund had little fear that the Danes would venture upon an attack. They had indeed no reason for haste. The Saxon vessel was in their waters, and could not return so long as the storm continued to blow from the east. The next day parties of Danes were seen making their way across the swampy country from the direction of Yarmouth. As soon, however, as these approached near enough to see the Saxons in readiness on the walls of the castle, they retired at once, knowing that the place could be captured by nothing short of a prolonged and desperate siege. On the 4th day the storm abated, and the Saxons prepared to make their way seaward again. The wind still blew, but lightly, from the same quarter, and the sails would therefore be of no use. With their great oar power they were confident that once through the Danish flotilla they could defy pursuit. Accordingly they again embarked, and loosing the moorings rowed down towards Yarmouth. They had chosen a time when the tide was running in, for although this would hinder their progress it would equally impede their pursuers, while it would enable them to check their vessel in time did they find any unforeseen obstacle in their way. They entered the river and rowed along quietly until they neared the walls of the town. Here the river was at its narrowest, and they saw the Danish galleys gathered thickly on the stream. Edmund and Egbert were on the forecastle, and presently gave the signal for the men to cease rowing. "It's just as I expected," Egbert said. "They have formed a boom across the river of trunks of trees and beams lashed together. We cannot make our way down until that obstacle is removed. What say you, Edmund?" "Well, I agree with you," Edmund replied. "We had best keep along close to the right bank until within a short distance of the boom. Then we must land the greater part of our men. These must march along the bank in their phalanx. The others must keep the boat moving close alongside, and from the forecastle they will be able to fire down upon the Danes and aid those on shore to drive them back and make their way to the end of the boom. They have but to cut the lashings there and the whole will swing round. But now we must see the nature of the obstacle and what is to be done. it were best to wait until the tide turns. In the first place, fewer men will be needed on board the ship, as she will advance by herself abreast of the men on shore. In the second place, when the lashing is cut, the boom will then swing down the stream, will cause confusion among the boats behind it, and will open a clear space for us to make our way down." Edmund agreed. A light anchor was dropped, and the Dragon rode quietly in the stream. Great animation was evident among the Danes. Large numbers crossed the river, and a strong force gathered at either end of the boom and in boats close behind it, to prevent the Saxons from attempting to cut the lashings. There was little uneasiness on board the Dragon. The Saxons were confident now of the power of their close formation to force its way through any number of the enemy, and they would gain such assistance from the fire from the lofty forecastle that they doubted not that they should be able to drive back the Danes and destroy the boom. In an hour the tide no longer rose. They waited till it ran down with full force, then the anchor was hauled up and the Dragon rowed to the bank. 60 of the fighting men, headed by Egbert, leaped on shore. Edmund with the remainder took his place on the forecastle. The oars next to the bank were drawn in, and some of those on the outward side manned by the sailors. Then, in its usual order, the phalanx moved slowly forward, while the ship floated along beside them close to the bank. The Danes, with loud shouts, advanced to meet them, and the arrows soon began to fly thickly. Covered by the long shields of the front rank, the Saxons moved forward steadily, while, as the Danes approached, the archers on the forecastle opened a destructive fire upon them. The confidence of the Saxons was justified, for the combat was never in doubt. Although the Northmen fought bravely, they were unable to withstand the steady advance of the wedge of spears, and very many fell beneath the rain of arrows from above. Steadily the wedge made its way until it reached the end of the boom. A few blows with their axes sufficed to cut the cables which fastened it in its place. As soon as this was done, Edmund gave a shout, and the Saxons at once sprang on board the ship, which, before the Danes could follow them, was steered out into the stream. As Egbert had foreseen, the boom, as it swung around, swept before it a number of the Danish boats, and imprisoned them between it and the shore. The oars were soon run out, and while the men on the forecastle continued their fire at the Danish boats, the others, seizing the oars, swept the Dragon along the stream. The Danes strove desperately to arrest her progress. Some tried to run alongside and board, others dashed in among the oars and impeded the work of the rowers, while from the walls of the town showers of missiles were poured down upon her. But the tide was gaining every moment in strength, and, partly drifting, partly rowing, the Dragon, like a bull attacked by a pack of dogs, made her way down the river. Every effort of the Danes to board was defeated, and many of their boats sunk, and at last she made her way into the open sea. There her sails were hoisted, and she soon left her pursuers behind. Once at sea, her course was again turned north, and, picking up some prizes on the way, she took up her station off the mouth of the Humber. Several ships were captured as they sailed out from the river. After the spoil on board was taken out, these, instead of being burnt, as had always been the case before, were allowed to proceed on their way, since had they been destroyed the crews must either have been slain or landed. The first course was repugnant to Edmund, the second could not be adopted, because they would have carried the news to the Danes and that the Dragon was off the river, and no more ships would have put to sea. And indeed so large was the number of Danish vessels always up the Humber that a fleet could easily have been equipped and sent out, before which the Dragon must have taken flight. One day a large sailing ship was seen coming out. The Dragon remained with lowered sail until she had passed, then started in pursuit, and speedily came up with the Danish vessel. Edmund summoned her to surrender, and was answered by a Norseman of great stature and noble appearance, who from the poop hurled a javelin which would have pierced Edmund had he not leaped quickly aside. A few other darts were thrown, and then the Dragon ran alongside the enemy and boarded her. The opposition of the Northmen was speedily beaten down, but their leader desperately defended the ladder leading to the poop. He was struck by 2 arrows and fell on one knee, and Edmund was about to climb the ladder when the door of the cabin in the poop opened, and a Norse maiden some 16 years old sprang out. Seeing her father wounded at the top of the ladder and the Saxons preparing to ascend it, while others turned their bows against the wounded Northman, she sprang forward and, throwing herself upon her knees before Edmund, besought him to spare her father's life. Edmund raised his hand and the bows were lowered. "I have no wish to slay your father, maiden," he said gently. We slay only those who resist, and resistance on the part of a single man, and he wounded, against a whole ship's crew, is madness. We are no sea wolves who slay for the pleasure of slaying, but are Saxons who fight for our country against the oppressions and rapine of your people. Little right have they to mercy, seeing they show none, but our religion enjoins us to have pity even upon our enemies. You had best ascend to your father and see to his wounds. None will harm you or him." The girl, with an exclamation of thanks, sprang up the ladder. Edmund superintended the searching of the ship. She contained a great store of valuables, which were speedily transferred to the Dragon. When this had been done, Edmund ascended to the poop. The jarl was sitting in a great chair placed there. Edmund had already learnt from the crew that he was Jarl Siegbert, a noted leader of the Northmen. His daughter had drawn out the arrows and bandaged the wounds. "Jarl Siegbert," Edmund said as he approached him, "you have been a bitter enemy of the Saxons, and small mercy have you shown to those who have fallen into your hands. But learn now that we, Christian Saxons, take no vengeance on a defenceless foe. You are free to pursue your voyage with your daughter and your ship to Norway. Your stores we have made free with, seeing that they are all plunder taken from the Saxons, and we do but reclaim our own." "And who are you, young sir?" the jarl asked. "I am one of King Alfred's ealdormen of Wessex, Edmund by name." "I have heard of you," the Dane said, "as one who has taught the Saxons new tactics, fighting in a close body which has more than once pierced our lines and caused our overthrow. But you are a mere lad." "I am young," Edmund replied, "and had it not been for the invasions and oppressions of your countrymen, might have still accounted myself as scarce a man. But you have made warriors of every West Saxon capable of bearing a sword. Remember, Jarl, that your life has been in Saxon hands, and that they have spared it. So come not hither to our shores again." "I propose not doing so," the Northman replied. "I have seen enough of stricken fields, and was returning to my own country to hang up my sword, content with the fame I have gained, until Woden called me to join his warriors and feast in his halls. Since we may not meet there, young Saxon, for they say that you Christians look to a place where arms will be laid aside and the sound of feasting be unheard, I will say farewell. For myself, I thank you not for my life, for I would rather have died as I have lived, with my sword in my hand, but for my daughter's sake I thank you, for she is but young to be left unprotected in the world." A few minutes later the Danish vessel continued on her way, and the Dragon again took her station on the lookout. She was now deep in the water, and after picking up one or two more small prizes, Edmund and Egbert determined to return home. It was probable that the Danes would soon take the alarm and dispatch a fleet to attack them. Laden down as the Dragon was, her speed under oars was materially affected, and it was advisable to stow away their booty before proceeding with further adventures. Her head was turned south, and she coasted down the eastern shores of England without adventure. Several Danish vessels were seen arriving at or quitting the coast, but the Dragon continued her course without heeding them, and rounding the Forelands sailed along the south coast and made her way up the Parrot. Upon inquiry they learned that no event of any importance had taken place during their absence. The Danes were complete masters of the country. King Alfred was in hiding, none knew where. The greater portion of the Danes were at their camp at Chippenham, but parties roamed here and there through the land. Dressed as countrymen, Edmund and Egbert made their way to Exeter, and there arranged with some traders for the purchase of the less valuable portion of the Dragon's cargo. This consisted of rich clothing, silks and other stuffs, wine, vestments and altar hangings from the churches, arms and armour, hides and skins. The prices obtained were far below the real value of the articles, for money was scarce, and none could say when the Danes might again swoop down and clear out the contents of the warehouses. Nevertheless, the sum obtained was a large one for those days, and this did not include the value of the gold and silver goblets, salvers, vases, and utensils used in the celebration of religious services. Of these, spoiled from the houses of the wealthy, and the churches and monasteries, they had obtained a considerable number. These were buried in the wood near the lonely spot at which the Dragon was moored. The rest of the cargo was sent in waggons, the more valuable portions hidden under the hides and skins, to Exeter. The amount which had been obtained from the cargo was divided as agreed before starting. 25 shares were set apart for the king, 25 shares were divided between the two leaders, and each soldier and sailor had 1 share. All were well satisfied with the success of the adventure, and with the damage which they had inflicted upon the Danes. A fortnight's leave was given for the men to visit their homes, and the money which they had gained in their trip was of great use to their friends in enabling them to repair the damages effected by the Danes. Not a man was absent at the appointed time, and the Dragon again made her way down to the sea. It was midwinter now, and they cruised along the southern coast of England without perceiving a single hostile sail. They lay for a week off the mouth of the Thames, and then saw 4 large Danish vessels making their way down the river. They were all vessels of the largest size, strongly built and full of men, and the Saxons judged them to be too strong to be attacked in company. The Northmen, on seeing the Golden Dragon flying on the masthead of the Saxon ship, at once made towards her, keeping in a close body, but the Dragon with sails and oars easily left them behind, and the Danes, giving up the pursuit, continued on their way. The Dragon fell into their wake and followed at a distance, hoping that one might prove slower than the others, or that they might in the night get separated. At nightfall, however, the Danes lit cressets of tar and hemp, which enabled them not only to keep close together, but sent out a wide circle of light, so that they could perceive the Dragon should she venture to approach. For 2 days and nights the Dragon followed patiently. "The weather is about to change," Egbert said on the 3rd morning. "Methinks that there is a storm brewing, and if this be so, the Northmen may well get separated, and we may pick up one away from her fellows." Darker and darker grew the sky, and the wind soon blew in furious gusts, raising a sea so heavy that the Saxons were obliged to lay in their oars. By nightfall it was blowing a furious gale. In the gathering darkness and the flying scud the ships of the Danes were lost sight of, but this was of little consequence now, for the attention of the Saxons was directed to their own safety. For the next 3 days their position was one of the greatest danger. With only a rag of sail set, they ran before the gale from the southwest. Every wave as it overtook them threatened the destruction of the ship, but the Dragon, light and buoyant and ably handled, rode safely over the waves. On the 4th morning the wind was still blowing fiercely, although its force had in some degree moderated. As the daylight dawned, Edmund and Egbert, who had hardly left the poop since the storm began, looked anxiously ahead. "Surely, Edmund, I see a dark mass ahead," Egbert exclaimed. For a minute or two Edmund gazed silently ahead. "It is so, Egbert," he said. "It is a rocky coast. Do you not see a white fringe below where the waves strike against it?" As the light became clearer the imminence of their peril grew even more distinct. A lofty iron-bound coast rose in front of them, and extended as far as the eye could reach on either hand. The seas broke with terrible force against its base, sending its spray far up on the cliffs. "Could we bring her about?" Edmund asked the chief of the sailors. "It would be useless," the man said. "She could not make her way in the teeth of this gale." "That I see, but at present we are rushing on to destruction. If we bring her to the wind we may run some distance along the coast before we are driven ashore, and may perceive some spot towards which we might direct her with a chance of making land ere she goes to pieces." The sail was still further lessened, and the ship's head brought round parallel with the coast. The Dragon laboured tremendously as the sea struck her full on the beam, and every wave flooded her low waist. Each sea which struck her lifted her bodily to leeward, and for every foot she sailed forward she was driven one toward the coast. This was now but 3 miles distant, and another hour would ensure her destruction, for none there hoped that the anchors, even should they find bottom, could hold her for an instant in the teeth of the gale. Every eye was directed toward the shore, but no break could be seen in the wall of rock which rose almost perpendicularly from the water. "I fear it is hopeless," Edmund said to Egbert. "The strongest swimmer would be dashed to pieces in an instant against those rocks." "He would indeed," Egbert replied. "I wish now that we had boldly engaged the 4 Danish ships. Far better would it have been for us to have died fighting for England on her decks than to have perished here." The time passed slowly. Every minute the Dragon was swept nearer and nearer toward the rocks. "She will just make that headland," the master sailor said, "and that is all. Once round it we had best turn her head to the rocks. If the cliffs rise as here sheer from the water, the moment she strikes will be the last for all of us. But if the rocks are, as in some places, piled high at the foot of the cliffs, a few may possibly manage to leap from her forecastle as she strikes and to clamber up." Scarce a word was spoken on board the Dragon as she came abreast of the headland. It was but a few hundred yards away. The roar of the seas as they struck its base sounded high above the din of the storm. Great sheets of foam were thrown up to a vast height, and the turmoil of the water from the reflux of the waves was so great that the Dragon was tossed upon it like a cockboat, and each man had to grasp at shroud or bulwark to retain his footings. Suddenly a cheer burst from end to end of the ship. Beyond the headland a great gap was visible, a quarter of a mile wide, as if the cliffs had been rent in sunder by some tremendous convulsion, and a fjord was seen stretching away in the bosom of the hills as far as the eye could reach. The Dragon's head was turned, and soon she was flying before the wind up the inlet. A mile farther and the fjord widened to a lake some 2 miles across, between steep hills clothed from foot to summit with trees. Its course was winding, and they were soon sheltered from the gale, and were gliding quietly over comparatively tranquil waters. 10 miles up the anchor was let go in a sheltered inlet, and Edmund summoned the whole crew to return thanks to God for their marvellous escape. The Dragon had suffered severely in her conflict with the elements. Her large sails had been split or blown away, the bulwarks at her waist had been shattered, and considerable damage done to her gear and fittings. 24 hours were allowed to the men for rest after their labours, and then all hands were set to work to refit. The next morning Edmund said to his kinsman, "I will take 2 of the men and go ashore to hunt. There should be wild boar and deer in these forests, and all would be glad of some fresh meat." "Be careful, Edmund. Remember you are in the country of our enemies, for without doubt this land to which we have been blown is Norway, and although we can see no signs of habitations, there may well be villages somewhere among these hills." "I will be careful," Edmund said, laughing, "and if I do not return in 2 days, do you set sail without me. I should like to discover the abode of some northern jarl. It would indeed be a grand retaliation to give them a taste of the sufferings they have inflicted upon us." "Aye, that would be good work," Egbert said. "Nevertheless, I own that at present I am anxious to be at sea again." 2 days will be sufficient to refit," Edmund said, "and then we will spread our wings. Goodbye, Egbert. I will be back by sunset, and I hope with a deer or 2. Selecting a couple of followers, both skilled with the bow and all being armed with spears, Edmund leapt ashore, for the water was deep up to the rocks, and the Dragon had been moored alongside for the convenience of taking on board the wood for the repairs. Although those on board the Dragon guessed it not, many eyes were watching them. A small fishing village lay at the edge of the fjord, a mile or 2 beyond the inlet in which the ship was moored. Hidden as they were among the trees, the huts had not been noticed by the Saxons, but the strange ship had been seen by some of those in the village, and the fishermen at once pronounced that whencesoever she might have come she was assuredly no Northman's ship. Messengers had immediately been sent to the villages among the hills. These were widely scattered, and it was not until the day after the ship's arrival that a force was collected which was deemed sufficient to attack it. Already, as Edmund leapt ashore, the Norsemen were making their way quietly through the forest towards the Dragon. Edmund had advanced but a few hundred yards up the hillside when a large party of Norsemen sprang up upon him. 2 Saxon arrows flew true to their marks, then the Danes rushed upon them. So far no words had been spoken, but Edmund placed to his lips the whistle with which he gave orders on board the ship, and blew a long shrill note, and then shouted at the top of his voice, "The Danes! The Danes! Push off!" The instant afterwards he was attacked. He and his men fought bravely, but in a few seconds the latter were cut down, and Edmund was levelled to the ground by a tremendous blow from a club. A minute later the din of battle rose by the water's side. Edmund's whistle and shout had been heard, and the Saxons on shore sprang on board and seized their spears and bows, just as the Danes poured down through the trees. For a time the Saxons defended the ship against the desperate attempt of the Danes to gain footing on her, but seeing the number of its assailants, and being certain that Edmund was killed or captured, Egbert ordered the ropes to be cut, and the Dragon was thrust away from the rocks. The oars were then got out, and she rowed out of bowshot from the shore. Then Egbert held a consultation with the leading men among the Saxons. All on board were filled with grief at the loss of their young leader, but they felt that nothing could be done for him, and it would be but courting danger to remain longer in the fjord. Since so large a force had been collected in the forest, news might have been sent to the ports, and at any moment they might see a fleet of the Northmen's galleys barring their retreat. Therefore, with bitter grief and lamentation, the Dragon's sails were hoisted, and she made her way to sea. "My only consolation is," Egbert said, "that if the brave lad is not killed at once, he may yet find his way back to England. He is ready of wit and full of invention, that if any can possibly extricate themselves from such a strait, it is assuredly he. But I fear that he fell in the first onslaught. Brave lad, even in the moment of his own peril he thought first of us. Had it not been for his timely warning we should have been taken unawares, and many must have been killed, even if the Dragon herself escaped capture." The storm had entirely abated, and the waters sparkled brightly in the cold January sun as the Dragon sailed out between the two headlands into the sea. Very different were the feelings of the crew to those which had animated them when 2 days before they had passed through the Channel. Then every heart beat with joy and thankfulness. Now the deepest depression and grief reigned on board. Edmund was adored by his followers. His kindness as their ealdorman, his skill and bravery as a leader, his cheerfulness and brightness under every danger and peril, had immensely endeared him to their hearts, and each man felt that he had sustained an irretrievable loss, and that with their chief the spirit which had animated the Dragon and directed their enterprises was gone. Egbert was a valiant warrior, and was an admirable second to an enterprising leader, but he was altogether without initiative, and, except when excited by danger, was dull and silent. Although all esteemed him and honoured him for his strength and bravery, they felt that he would be but a poor substitute indeed for the leader they had lost. Chapter 9. The Prisoner. When Edmund recovered his senses he found that he was being carried along on a rough litter through the forest. It was some little time before he realized his position and recalled the circumstances of the attack. After the Dragon had moved safely out into the fjord, his assailants had returned to the spot where they had attacked the 3 Saxons who had landed. 2 of them were without life, but they found that the third, who from his habiliments was evidently of higher rank, and whom they judged, although still but a youth, to be the commander of the Saxon party, had only been stunned by the blow of the club which had felled him. It was at once resolved to carry him to the jarl of the district, who would assuredly wish to learn from him the meaning of the coming of the strange ship. That the Dragon was a Saxon vessel the Northmen were sure. Many of them had been on expeditions across the seas, and knew the Saxons both from their dress and manner of wearing their hair. But the ship was unlike anything they had seen before, and it seemed above all things strange that when, as they understood, England had been completely conquered, Saxon warships should be entering a northern fjord. For many hours Edmund was carried through the forest. He wondered to himself whether he would be slain on his arrival or kept as a slave, for the Norse and Saxon tongues were so similar that he was perfectly able to understand the language of his captors. A party of 12 men accompanied him, 4 of whom bore the litter, and were relieved at intervals by the others. After some hours the feelings of giddiness and weakness passed off, and on the men stopping to change bearers, he expressed his readiness to walk. Hitherto he had lain with his eyes closed, as he thought it better to remain as he was, until he felt perfectly able to keep up with his captors in a journey which might, for aught he knew, be a long time. The Northmen expressed their satisfaction at finding that their burden need no longer be carried, and throwing aside the boughs which had formed the litter, proceeded with him on their way. They asked him many questions concerning the Dragon. Most of these he answered readily, but he evaded those as to the place where she had been built, or the port from which she had sailed. It was not until late in the afternoon that they arrived at the abode of the Jarl Bjorn. It was a rough abode, constructed of timber, thatched with rushes, for as yet the Northmen were scarcely a settled people, the tribes for the most part wandering in the forests hunting when not engaged in those warlike expeditions which they loved above all other things. Only the leaders dwelt in anything like permanent abodes, the rest raising huts of boughs at such places as they might make any stay at. One of Edmund's conductors had gone on ahead, and as the party approached the building Bjorn came out from his house to meet them. He was, like almost all Northmen, a man of great stature and immense strength. Some 50 years had passed over his head, but he was still in the prime of his life. For the Northmen, owing to their life of constant activity, the development of their muscles from childhood, and their existence passed in the open air, retained their strength and vigour to a great age. So assiduous was their training, and so rapidly did their figures develop in consequence, that at the age of 15 a young Northman received arms and was regarded as a man, although he did not marry until many years afterwards, early wedlock being strongly discouraged among them. By Bjorn's side stood his son, who, though but 22 years old, rivalled him in stature and in muscular development, although lacking the great width of shoulder of the jarl. As Edmund approached, a war horse of the jarl, fastened up to a post close to the entrance of the house, neighed loudly. Bjorn looked surprised. The neighing of a horse among the Northmen was regarded as the happiest of auguries, and in their sacred groves horses were tied up, as the neighing of these animals was considered an infallible proof that a propitious answer would be given by the gods to the prayer of any petitioner who sought their aid. "By Thor!" Bjorn exclaimed, "my good war horse welcomes the stranger. As I said to you anon, Sweyn, I had intended to offer him as a sacrifice to Odin, but as the gods have thus declared him welcome here, I must needs change my intentions. Who are you, young Saxon?" he asked as Edmund was brought before him, "and whence do you come, and how is it that a warship of your people is found upon our coasts?" "I am Edmund," the young man said steadily, "an ealdorman of King Alfred of the West Saxons. The ship which was seen on your coast is mine. I built it to attack the Northmen who harry our coasts. I am here because, when in chase of 4 of your ships, a storm arose and blew us thither." "You speak boldly," the jarl said, "for one in the hands of his foes. How old are you?" "I am 22, Edmund replied. "Well, the same age as you, Sweyn. Stand side by side and let me compare you. Ay," he went on, "he lacks nigh 3 inches of your height, but he is more than that bigger across the shoulders. A stalwart young champion indeed, and does brave credit to his rearing. These West Saxons have shown themselves worthy foemen, and handled us roughly last year, as this will testify," and he pointed to the scar of a sword cut across his face. "Doubtless this is the son of that Saxon earl who more than once last summer inflicted heavy losses upon us. Is that so, young Saxon?" "I am the ealdorman Edmund himself," the young man replied quietly. "My successes were won not by my own strength or courage, but by the valour of those under me, who, fighting in a novel manner, gained advantage over your Northmen." "By Thor!" Bjorn exclaimed, "and this is the youth who attacked us at night and drove off the cattle we had taken, and slew many of our followers, Sweyn. Truly he would be a rare sacrifice to offer to Odin, but the god has himself welcomed him here." "It may be that he welcomed him as a sacrifice, father," Sweyn suggested. "Ah, that may be so," the jarl replied. "We must consult the omens to find out the true meaning of my charger's neighing. Nevertheless, in either case I shall be content, for he be not welcomed as a sacrifice, he is welcome as bringing good fortune, and in truth he will make a noble cup-bearer to me. It is not every jarl who is waited upon by a Saxon ealdorman. But till the omens have spoken, let him be set aside and carefully watched. In a day or two we will journey to Odin's temple and there consult the auguries." 3 days passed, during which Edmund was well fed and treated. At the end of that time he was ordered to accompany the jarl on a journey. 2 days' travelling brought them to a temple of Odin. It was a rough structure of unhewn stone situated in a wood. Bjorn and his son entered, while Edmund remained without under a guard. Presently the jarl and his son came out with a priest. The latter carried a white bag in his hand with 12 small pieces of wood. On half of these 4 small nicks were cut, on the other 5 nicks. All were placed in the bag, which was then shaken. "Now," the priest said, "you will see the will of Odin. The first 3 sticks drawn out will declare it. If 2 of the 3 bear an even number of nicks, the neighing of your horse signifies that Odin accepted the sacrifice. If 2 of them bear unequal numbers, then it meant his coming was propitious to you." The bag was again shaken. Edmund looked on calmly, for Saxons and Northmen alike disdained to show the slightest fear of death. Even the colour did not fade from his cheek as he watched the trial upon which his life depended. The first stick drawn out bore 5 marks. The priest showed it to the jarl, and without a word dropped it in the bag again. This was again shaken, and another stick drawn out. This bore but 4 notches. The chances were even. The silence was unbroken until the 3rd twig was drawn. "Odin has spoken," the priest said. "The neigh of the horse indicated that the coming of this Saxon was propitious to your house." The jarl gave an exclamation of satisfaction, while Sweyn's brow darkened. Bjorn had indeed set his heart upon retaining this famous young Saxon leader as his slave and cupbearer, and it was probable that in his interview with the priest before the drawing his inclinations had been clearly shown, for a slight difference between the thickness of the sticks might well have existed and served as an index to the priest in drawing them. Bjorn, in his gratification at the answer of the god, bestowed a handsome present upon the priest, and then rode back to his abode well content with his journey. Edmund was at once installed in his new duties. Hitherto he had not entered the house nor seen the females of the family. Ulfra, the jarl's wife, was a woman of commanding stature and appearance. Like most of the northern women, she had accompanied her husband in his many wanderings, and shared his dangers and privations. The wives of the Norsemen occupied a far more exalted position in the households of their lords than those of the people of southern Europe. They were not only mistresses of the house, but were treated with respect as well as with affection. They were not, as in the south, regarded as puppets for the amusement of an idle hour, but were the companions and advisers of their husbands, occupying a position at least as free and respected as at the present day. There were 2 daughters, who both bade fair to resemble their mother in stature and dignity of demeanour, for both were models of female strength and activity. Edmund's duties were light. In the morning he gathered firewood for the household. At the meals he handed the dishes, and taking his station behind the jarl's chair, refilled his goblet with mead as often as it was empty. Usually a large party sat down to supper, for an expedition to France was talked of in the spring, and the jarls and warriors often met to discuss the place of starting, the arrangements for the voyage, and the numbers which each leader would place in the field. The feasts, of course, were kept up to a late hour, and, as was the invariable custom of the Northmen, the arrangements decided upon overnight were rediscussed at a morning meeting, for they held that while over the wine cup each man would speak the truth frankly and honestly, the colder counsels and greater prudence which the morning brought were needed before any matter could be finally settled. A month thus passed, and Bjorn, his family and followers then moved south, as there was to be a great conference near the southern point of the country, at which a large number of the chiefs from Denmark were to be present. Edmund observed that, for some reason, Sweyn was looking forward anxiously to this meeting, and his sisters more than once joked him about his anxiety. "Pooh, pooh," the jarl said one day in answer to such an observation. "Sweyn is but a lad yet. I know not what you are driving at, and that Sweyn is smitten with the charms of my old companion's daughter, the pretty Freda. I noted it when we were in camp together, but it will be fully another 10 years yet before Sweyn can think of marrying. He's got to win for himself the name of a great warrior before a jarl's daughter of proper spirit would so much as think of him. When he has the spoils of France to lay at her feet, it will be time enough." Sweyn made no reply, but Edmund saw that he was far from pleased at his father's words, and a look of surly determination on his face showed the young Saxon that he would go his own way in the matter if it lay in his power. After 10 days' travelling the party arrived at the rendezvous. Here, drawn up on the shore, were a vast number of galleys of all sizes, for the greater part of those who had assembled had journeyed by sea. Great numbers of huts of boughs and many tents constructed of sails had been erected. Edmund and the other slaves, these being either Saxons or Franks captured in war, soon erected bowers for the jarl and his family. Edmund had been looking forward to the meeting with much anxiety, for he had judged that some mode of escape might there open to him. Among the Saxon slaves were several young men of strength and vigour, and Edmund had confided to them his project of stealing a boat and sailing away in it, and they, knowing that he had experience in navigation, had readily consented to join him in making an effort for freedom. The jarl and his family were warmly welcomed by many of their companions in arms, and the day after their arrival Bjorn told Edmund to accompany him to a banquet, at which he and his family were to be present. At 4 in the afternoon they set out, and presently arrived at a large tent. Edmund waited without until the attendants carried in the dishes, when he entered with them and prepared to take his place behind his master's seat. From a few words which had passed between Sweyn and his sisters, Edmund doubted not that the companion with whom Bjorn was going to dine was the father of the maiden about whom they had joked him. He was not surprised when, on entering, he saw Sweyn talking earnestly with a damsel somewhat apart from the rest. The entrance of the viands was the signal for all to take their places at the table. They were in all 16 in number, and as nearly half were women, the meeting was evidently of a family character, as upon occasions of importance, or when serious discussions were to take place, men alone sat down. As Edmund advanced to take his place, his eye fell upon the jarl, who seated himself at the head of the table, and as he did so he gave a slight start of surprise, for he at once recognized in him the Northman Siegbert, whose ship he had stopped at the mouth of the Humber. From him his eye glanced at the girl by whose side Sweyn was on the point of seating himself, and recognized in her the maiden who had besought her father's life. The dinner commenced and proceeded for some little time, when Edmund saw the girl looking fixedly at him. "Who is that who is standing behind your father's chair?" she asked Sweyn. "A Saxon slave," he answered. "His vessel was well nigh wrecked on our coast. Our people captured him and slew some of his followers, and the ship speedily took to flight." "Father," the girl said in a clear voice which at once attracted the attention of all, "unless my eyes deceive me, the young Saxon standing behind Jarl Beorn is he whose ship captured us as we left England, and who suffered no harm to be done to us." The Northman turned in his chair. "It is he, Freda, sure enough, though how he comes to be a slave here to my comrade Beorn I know not. Beorn, my friend, I owe this youth a great debt of gratitude. He had my life and the life and honour of Freda in his hands, and he spared both, and slave though he may be of yours at present, yet I hail him as my friend. Tell me, how came he in your hands? He is Edmund, the valiant young Saxon who smote us more than once so heavily down in Wessex." "I know it," Beorn replied, "and will tell you how he came into my hands, and in truth he was captured by accident, and not by any valour of my arm." The jarl then related the circumstances under which Edmund had been captured, and the narrow escape he had had of being offered as a sacrifice to Odin, and Siegbert then told his guests at length the incidents of his capture by the dragon. "He let me go, and without a ransom," he concluded, "and that part of my obligation I should be glad to repay, though for his gentleness to Freda I must still remain his debtor. What say you, Beorn, will you sell him to me? Name your price in horses, arms, and armour, and whatever it be I will pay it to you." "In truth, Siegbert," Beorn said, "I like not to part with the lad, but since you are so urgent, and seeing that you cannot otherwise discharge the obligation under which, as you say, he has laid you, I cannot refuse your prayer. As to the price, we will arrange that anon." "Then it is settled," Siegbert said. "You are a free man, Ealdorman Edmund," and he held out his hand to the youth. "Now seat yourself at the table with my guests. There are none here who may feel honoured at dining with one of King Alfred's bravest thanes." The transformation in Edmund's position was sudden indeed. A moment since he was a slave, and although he had determined upon making an effort for freedom, he had known that the chances of escape were small, as swift galleys would have been sent off in pursuit, and it was probable that he would have been speedily overtaken and brought back. Now he was free, and would doubtless be allowed to return home with the first party who sailed thither. Siegbert at once tried to make Edmund feel at home, addressing much of his conversation to him. Beorn too spoke in a friendly manner with him, but Sweyn was silent and sullen. He was clearly ill pleased at this change of fortune which had turned his father's slave into a fellow guest and equal. His annoyance was greatly heightened by the fact that it was Freda who had recognized the young Saxon, and the pleasure which her face evinced when her father proposed to purchase him from Beorn angered him even more. In his heart he cursed the horse whose welcome neigh had in the first instance saved Edmund's life, and the trial by augury which had confirmed the first omen. After the banquet was over, Siegbert requested Edmund to relate his various adventures. The telling of tales daring was one of the favourite amusements of the Danes. Siegbert and his friends quaffed great bumpers of mead, and the ladies sat apart listening while Edmund told his story. "You have a brave record indeed," Siegbert said when he had finished. "For one so young and fond as are our youths of adventure, there is not one of them of your age who has accomplished a tithe of what you have done. Why, Freda, if this youth were but one of us, he would have the hearts of all the Norse maidens at his feet. In the eyes of a Danish girl, as of a Dane, valour is the highest of recommendations." "Oh, I don't know, father," Freda said, colouring at being thus addressed, "that we should be as bold as that, although assuredly it is but right that a maiden should esteem valour highly. It is to her husband she has to look for protection, and she shares in the honour and spoil which he gains by his valiant deeds, so you have always taught me." "And rightly too, girl. Next to being a great hero, the greatest honour is to be the wife of one. I pledge you, Ealdorman Edmund, and should be right proud were you a son of mine. You have told your story modestly, for many of the battles and adventures of which you have spoken are known to me by report, and fame has given you a larger share in the successes than you claim for yourself. 'Tis a pity you were not born a Northman, for there is little for you to do in Saxon England now." "I do not despair yet," Edmund replied. "Things have gone badly with us, but the last blow is not struck yet. You will hear of King Alfred in the spring, unless I am mistaken." "But they say your King Alfred is half a monk, and that he loves reading books more than handling the sword, though, to do him justice, he has shown himself a brave warrior, and has given us far more trouble than all the other Saxon kings together." "King Alfred fights bravely," Edmund said, "because he is fighting for his country and people. But it is true that he loves not war nor strife. He reads much and thinks more, and should he ever come to his kingdom again he will assuredly be one of the wisest and best monarchs who has ever sat on a throne. He has talked to me much of the things which he has at heart, and I know he intends to draw up wise laws for the ruling of his people." "We love not greatly being ruled, we Northmen," Beorn said, "but for each to go his own way as he wills, provided only he inflicts no ill will upon his neighbour. We come and we go each as it pleases him. Our fleets traverse the sea and bring home plunder and booty. What need we of laws?" "Well, at present you have no great need of laws," Edmund replied, "seeing that you lead a wandering life; but when the time shall come, and it must come to you as it has come to other nations, when you will settle down as a rich and powerful community, then laws will become necessary." "Well," Beorn said, "right glad am I that I lived before such times have come. So far I can see the settling down you speak of, and the abandonment of the ancient gods, has done no great good either to you Saxons or to the Franks. Both of you were in the old time valiant people, while now you are unable to withstand our arms. You gather goods and we carry them off. You build cities and we destroy them. You cultivate the land and we sweep off the crops. It seems to me that we have the best of it." "It seems so at present," Edmund said, "but it will not last. Already in Northumbria and in East Anglia the Danes, seeing that there is no more plunder to be had, are settling down and adopting the customs of the Saxons, and so will it be in Mercia and Wessex if you keep your hold on them, and so will it be in other places. The change is but beginning, but it seems to me certain to come. So I have heard King Alfred say." "And does he think," Sweyn said scoffingly, speaking almost for the first time, "that we shall abandon the worship of our gods and take to that of your Christ?" "He thinks so and hopes so," Edmund replied quietly. "So long as men's lives are spent wholly in war they may worship gods like yours, but when once settled in peaceful pursuits they will assuredly recognize the beauty and holiness of the life of Christ. Pardon me," he said, turning to Siegbert, "if it seems to you that I, being still young, speak with over boldness, but I am telling you what King Alfred says, and all men recognize his wisdom and goodness." "I know not of your religion myself," Siegbert replied, "but I will own willingly that though its teachings may be peaceful, it makes not cowards out of those who believe in it. I have seen over and over again old men and young men die on the altars of their churches as fearlessly and calmly as a Viking should do when his time comes. No Northman fears death, for he knows that a joyous time awaits him, but I am bound to say that your Christians meet death to the full as calmly. Well, each his own way, I say, and for aught I know there may be a Christian heaven as well as the halls of Odin, and all may be rewarded in their own way for their deeds." Bjorn and his party now rose to take leave. "I will come across to your tent in the morning," Siegbert said, "and we can then discuss what payment I shall make you for this young Saxon. I fear not that you will prove over hard to your old comrade." After Bjorn had departed, Siegbert assigned to Edmund a place in his tent as an honoured guest. Slaves brought in bundles of rushes for the beds. Freda retired to a small tent which had been erected for her adjoining the large one, and the jarl and Edmund lay down on their piles of rushes at the upper end of the tent. Siegbert's companions and followers stretched themselves along the sides, the slaves lay down without, and in a few minutes silence reigned in the tent.